Excited about the message today. We're going to be looking at another portion of Matthew 25. Last week we looked at Matthew chapter 25, verse 14. This week we're looking at verses 1 through 14. And so I'm excited about that. But let's have a word of prayer, and we are going to dig in. Thank you, Father, for this morning. Thank you for the people who are here. God, the things on their minds, clear the minds. Things on the heart that are burdens, Father, may they be cast aside. Help us, Father, to focus on you. Lord, whatever it is that may be crossing our minds, the distractions that are there, clear them out. Lord, help us to hear from you. May my words be cast aside, and Lord, may your word be heard in this time, and may we all have a deeper faith and a closer relationship because of these few moments that we're going to have together as we look into your scriptures. In Jesus Christ's name, amen. Amen. In January of 2017, a text message was sent to residents of Hawaii that informed them a ballistic missile was sent towards their island. They needed to take shelter immediately. The text message looked like this: emergency alert, ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. And for the next 38 minutes, the people on the island of Hawaii thought a missile was sent towards them and they needed to immediately take shelter. Everyone's plans changed. There was no more, hey, let's go to the beach, let's hang out at the pool. Everything changed at the point when this message was sent out, except for one guy. I don't know if you saw this guy or not when this had happened, if you're familiar with the story, but there's this one guy, he's playing golf, and he gets this message, and so he records a video and he sends it to his family. He says, "Family, I want you to know that I love you. There's a missile that's coming towards Hawaii, and apparently I'm going to die. And if I'm going to die, I'm going to keep doing what it is that I love." And he just kept right on playing golf. He just pushed him down the fairway. But for the majority of the people in Hawaii on that particular day, their lives seemingly changed forever, at the very least for that pocket of time until they found out this was a false alarm. But for that time, they were running for shelters. There were many messages sent to loved ones saying, "I love you, I'm sorry, I wish I wouldn't have said, I wish I wouldn't have done, I shouldn't have thought this away, I had this regret." And you see these things happening because when people felt like the end was coming, specifically as imminent as it was, in that particular moment, their perspective changed. And the way that they lived their lives changed. And the way that they managed their time changed. And in a way, that's really what the Bible teaches us, how Christians ought to live their lives. That in the grand scheme of the eternal, what we have here is just a sliver of time. Actually, James describes this time that we have in this world this way: why you do not even know, let me figure out how to read here, what will happen tomorrow? What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then it vanishes. That's how our time on earth is described, as a mist. It's like, psh, you see it and then it's gone. Just in a moment's time. That's what this life is. And if you're somebody who is living just for the here and the now, and you're not anticipating anything to come, you're not anticipating a future encounter with Jesus, then, man, that can be very discouraging and depressing. But if you do realize, like, this time is important, you'll never get this time back, all of a sudden you realize, if you're thinking towards the eternal, you're realizing, like, how do I make the best out of this time that I've got? And like the people in Hawaii, everything came into perspective when they got that text message, because for 38 minutes, they weren't living as if they were going to live forever anymore. They were living as if, hey, this is about to be it. This is all that's left of my life. And they begin to think about the next life, and they begin to think again about what their priorities need to be in this life. Everything changed for them when they began to think about the end, having the end in mind. And so we're in this sermon series entitled Good Sense. And in this series, we're evaluating how it is that God wants us to manage our resources. Specifically, how can we align our resources with God's priorities? And what I found, one of the most helpful ways to do this is, again, to think with the end in mind. The end being that day when this life ends, the next life begins, and then eternity just goes and goes and goes. And there's this ultimate encounter with Jesus that's going to take place then. If I think like that, it affects the way that I manage my time and my talents and my treasures and the truth that's been given to me and the testimony that I have, the transformation that's in my heart from Jesus Christ. All of that changes how I'm going to utilize those things when I think with the end in mind. with that day. And so if you're somebody here, as we talk about how to specifically manage our resources and even our finances to a certain extent, if you're somebody who doesn't believe in Jesus, I just want you to know that first of all, we want you to get Jesus, and we're not asking for anything from you. We don't want anything from you. Like money's like the fourth or fifth thing down the line that we want you to get. Number one, you have to get the cornerstone right before everything else is going to line up, and that's Jesus. Secondly, if you don't consider this your church home, I hope that we offer you some good food for thought, some things for you to consider, but really, in regards to supporting the ministry here at Valley View Christian Church, we want that for the people that consider this their church home. And wherever your church home is, we want you to support the mission of that church and support whatever it is that God is doing as, we realize that, hey, this life isn't all that there is. And God's kingdom needs to advance out. And one of the ways that does that is often through our generosity. And so as we think about this idea of having the end in mind, we're going to jump into Matthew chapter 25. And we're going to begin there in verse 1. At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. This is a parable. It's known as the parable of the 10 virgins. It's a parable that often is not taught on in churches. It's one that people generally aren't very familiar with. And actually, in some circles, they've used this specific verse and these next verses that are going to come after as an affirmation for polygamy. And I just want to say unequivocally that when you think about the end in mind, marrying multiple people is not where we're going with this. So that's not the direction we're heading with this whole thing. In fact, it's better to understand this as 10 bridesmaids. This is a wedding party. Expositor D.A. Carson describes it this way. Normally, the bridegroom will, with some close friends, that would be his side of the wedding party, left his home to go to the bride's home, where there were various ceremonies, followed by a procession through the streets after nightfall to his home. And that's why lamps are necessary. The 10 virgins may be bridesmaids who have been assisting the bride, and they expect to meet the groom as he comes from the bride's house. Now, when the groom comes, they don't know. That's part of the suspense of this tradition. He could come in a day, he could come in 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. They don't really know. They just need to be ready when he arrives. That's what happens in the first century. That was part of the celebration. That was part of the festival that would be this wedding ceremony. They'd be waiting for the bridegroom to arrive. And so Jesus leverages this cultural tradition of this day to teach this great principle about his kingdom, that ultimately he's going to come one day. We don't know when he's going to come, but we need to be ready for that end, which is the end of this life when that happens. We go on in the scriptures. 5 of them were foolish, 5 were wise. The foolish ones took their lamps, but did not take any oil with them. The wise ones, however, took oil in jars along with their lamps. And so how many of them are foolish? 5. How many are wise? 5. Yeah, it's right there. It's 5. It's pretty simple. We ask easy questions around here. 5. And the reason that they are wise and the reason that some of them are foolish is how they manage the oil. And the foolish ones, we're going to see the connection being made with their faith. And the reason that they are foolish is because they didn't have a faith in Jesus. They weren't ready for the end. They weren't ready for that day when they would encounter Jesus. And the outflow of their faith, the outflow of what they were anticipating, affected the way they managed the oil. 5 had extra oil. 5 didn't have enough oil. In this particular context of the first century, oil in many cases was a currency. It was a barter society. You would often trade one good for another good. And so oil was used obviously for weddings, funerals. Oil was used for fragrances. It was used for food. It was used for medicinal purposes. Oil had a lot of purposes. It was a very lucrative item to have in this particular time. And so what Jesus is saying here is that the way that you manage this resource, this currency in this particular day, is a great indicator of where your faith is actually at. And so these bridesmaids, some were ready and some weren't. And guess what? The bridegroom was a long time in coming, and they all became drowsy and fell asleep. And what we're going to find here is that some of them kept the faith. Some of them maybe never had faith at all, and they weren't ready, and so therefore they were foolish. The issue is not with his procrastination. The issue is with their preparation. And their preparation, the ones that had faith, was an indication of their faith. And that's the first lesson that we learn here, is that when we come to thinking about the end, your preparation is an indication of the faith that you really have. Too often, too many of us live as if we're going to live forever, that our lives are just going to go and go and go and go, and that day's never going to come. Like, there's really not an eternity to look forward to. But what Jesus teaches us is that one of the great indicators of our faith are those of us who are willing to store up treasures in heaven. He said this in Matthew 6, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Laura and I, we lived in Texas for a few years, and I was amazed with the amount of land that was found in Texas, and even specifically with the size of the ranches that were in Texas, just like this one here. I heard a story of one man who really came out of poverty, and through that, he was able to be incredibly successful in life, and he eventually came to the point where he purchased well over 10,000 acres of land. He had a good friend of his that he brought out to his ranch for the first time. They had dinner one night, and then this rancher took his friend out, this Christian friend of his out, and showed him the different areas of his property. He said, "Over there is the lake where my cattle are. Over there to the west is where the oil fields are. There to the south are the fields where we harvest the different grains. And up there to the north is just some of the beautiful prairie that we have." And he said, "I own all of this. 30 years ago, I didn't own any of it, but now I own it all." And his friend asked a very poignant question. He said, "I know you have something over there, and you own things over there, and you have something out west, and you have something down south." And then his friend asked, "But do you have anything up there? Do you have anything up there?" And the point is that this man was really living a lot for the here and the now, and his friend was trying to bring it into perspective that eventually your life is going to come to an end, and you're going to leave all of this stuff behind. Jesus tells a story about somebody like that in Luke chapter 12. It's a man who owned quite a bit of land, and a great harvest came in. So much, in fact, that it was overflowing the barns that he had. There was an incredible amount of surplus. And the surplus he could have used to help other people, to give back to his servants who were starving. I mean, there's more than enough. It was to the point that what he had coming in was going to certainly rot. It was going to corrode. And so what did he decide to do? Well, he decided to build bigger barns and to store up the surplus there. This is what the text said Jesus' response to this man would be. Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" See, his preparation was as if he was just going to keep living and living and living and living, not as if there was going to come to an end. And so somebody else is going to get it. And Jesus said, "This is how it will be for whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." It's hard to know how much this man would have been worth. I think it's pretty easy to say he probably could have been worth $100 million with the equivalent today. Now, if you had $100 million, you would say, "I would help this person, and I would do this, and I would go there, and I would be a part of this cause." No doubt you would say things like that, but we don't have that kind of money. I did read a study that said that the average American, though, has $2,000 worth of things just lying around their house that they could sell. Just $2,000 worth of things lying around their house. I mean, how many of you have a garage that looks like this? All right, the lawnmower has become a table. I don't know if you can see. The lawnmower is a table in this story. So you got $2,000 worth of stuff just laying around your house that nobody's using, you're not using, you don't even want it, and you can just go sell it and do something good with that money. Now, we've got about 200 families at this church, maybe a few more than that. It's hard to say. But if 200 families have $2,000 worth of just stuff lying around their house, that's $400,000 when it's all pulled together. What good could come out of that? So much good, more than we could possibly imagine. Now, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying go find the stuff you don't want and then bring it here and give it to me. So I just want to clarify that. I don't want your problem to become my problem. I don't want your junk to become our junk. You can do with it whatever you want whenever you find that stuff. But we all have things laying around that we can get rid of. We have surplus in our house, in our lives, that could go to benefit others. And getting back to our story here, so some of them weren't prepared. At midnight, the cry rang out, "Here's the bridegroom. Come out to meet him." And the idea of midnight is they didn't expect it. Midnight's a time in which you just don't expect things to happen. Come out to meet him. Then all the virgins woke up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish ones said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil. Our lamps are going out." "No," they replied, "there may not be enough for both of us and you. Instead, go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." You see, what's happening here is you've got half of them that were prepared and half of them that weren't. And so the half that weren't are trying to depend on the other people's faith. They're like, "Oh, wait, whoa, hold on, this is really going to happen. He's coming. Oh my goodness. Hey, can I get some of your faith?" It doesn't work like that. Inevitably, you can't depend on someone else's faith. Inevitably, that's not sustainable. Maybe for a season, maybe for a time, but there comes a point in which, hey, the bridegroom shows up and you're like, whoa, wait, oh man, and then everything starts to come into perspective and you realize, I really wasn't ready for this. I had one pastor tell me years ago, he said, and he was in his 60s at this time, he said, through all the years of ministry that I've done, what I've come to find is that when you're young, you think that your faith can save anyone. And then you get a little older and you realize your faith can just save you think that your faith can save your family and friends. And then you get a little older and you think that your faith can just save your family. And then you ultimately realize, my faith is just going to save me. Inevitably, these other people have to own it for themselves. And the lesson that we learn here is this, as we think about the end and being in mind, is do not get caught depending on someone else's faith. Now, how does this impact the way that we manage our resources and aligning them with God's priorities? Well, it impacts them this way, is that in most churches, and this is an approximate percentage that is thrown out, 20% of the people take care of the other 80%. And so 20% of the people give, and their generosity supports the other 80%. 20% serve, and then their service supports the other 80%. 20% evangelize, and that's probably an exaggeration, and they support the other 80%. But inevitably, there just comes a point in which you can't keep depending on other people's faith, and it's just not sustainable. It just doesn't work like that. But the way that we need to think about it is that if we can step into this and we can be willing to give into God's kingdom and invest in God's kingdom, it's an incredible investment. The return on it's absolutely remarkable. You have to transition from being a consumer to being a contributor. And that's the challenge. Like if you're a Christian or you're saying that you're a Christian, one of the great indicators of your faith is you move from consuming to ultimately contributing. We all have to contribute. Imagine it like this in life. Some of you drink coffee every day, and so let's just go with these numbers. A high-end cup of coffee costs about $3.50. And so if you just live your life consuming things and never contributing to an investment account, you're just consuming and consuming and consuming, inevitably that's not going to work out too well for you in the long run. And so let's imagine that you spend $3.50 on a cup of coffee a day. That's $105 a month, $1,260 a year. If you were to take that money, invest it instead of contribute it to an account, instead of taking that money and constantly consuming things with it, in 30 years' time, in a diversified index fund of some sort, you get $106,000. It's because whenever you invest and invest and invest, you contribute to the right things, those investments return inevitably, ultimately. Over that long of a period of time, you're going to get a great return. And this is an argument for lesser to greater. If this is true from a worldly standpoint, it's even more true from a spiritual standpoint. Jesus said these words in Matthew 19, that whoever sacrifices in this life will receive 100 times as much in the life to come. Now, if you knew of a guaranteed investment that was guaranteed to return 100 times, and you didn't tell me about that, I'd be mad at you. I might not let you in this church again. If you had that kind of a guarantee out there, like that is just rude if you have that kind of a guarantee and you don't tell people about it. And that's what we're talking about here. I wouldn't, if I knew about something that was going to return 100 times whatever you put into it, I wouldn't sit around and say, well, it might be a little awkward if we talk about this. I'd say, hey, you need to know about this. And that's kind of what I'm saying. Hey, you need to know about this. The end is going to come. There's going to come a point in which this life is over. And are you ready for that moment? And what have you stored up? What have you stored up in heaven? Or are you just kind of depending on other people's faith to keep getting you by? Well, getting back to our story, Matthew 25. While they were on their way, this would be the foolish bridesmaids, to buy the oil, the bridegroom arrived. The virgins who were ready went in with him to the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the others also came. Lord, Lord, they said, open the door for us. But he replied, truly, I tell you, I don't know you. Therefore keep watch, Jesus said, because you do not know the day or the hour. In Revelation 19 and 21, there's this thing known as the marriage feast of the Lamb. It's this incredible celebration that's going to take place one day in heaven in which everyone who is ever a believer in Jesus Christ gets brought into this incredible feast in which they get to have a seat at. It's going to be a tremendous honor. It's going to be something that truthfully in the grand scheme of time, probably only a few are going to get to experience. Really the ones who are prepared and ready for it get to experience. And then Jesus looks at these others and he says, you really didn't ever know me. I mean, I know you said the words sometimes to the song, and I know you went to church every once in a while, and I know you would mouth that you've got a little bit of faith, but really though you didn't. You didn't really know me. Because if you know me, it's going to impact the way that you live your life. And what Jesus is ultimately bringing this to is this point of death, is that death brings the important things into proper perspective. Maybe some of you have heard some variation of a parable that's known as the stockbroker parable. It's a parable of a stockbroker who comes upon a genie's lamp. And he says, what the heck, I've heard the stories. He picks up the lamp, he kind of rubs on it a little bit. Sure enough, a genie pops out. And the genie says, I know you've heard the stories, but you don't get 3 wishes, you only get 1. The stockbroker says, well, in that case, give me the newspaper for 1 year from today. The genie says, are you sure you just want a newspaper? And the stockbroker says, I just want a newspaper. And so he gets the newspaper from 1 year for the day. The stockbroker immediately turns to the business section, starts looking through the different funds, puts together a strategy. He says to himself, I'm going to have more money in a year's time than I know what to do with. This is amazing. He gets a little bored later on in the day and picks up the newspaper again just to see what the news was. And then he turned to the obituary section. And it's there that he sees a picture of himself. And immediately, all the money that he was going to make really doesn't matter anymore, because death's brought the proper things into perspective. And what he was planning on doing the next year changes dramatically. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, is that when you think about the end, it begins to bring this kind of stuff into perspective about what's really important and how it is that we ought to manage our resources. And we need to try to give back and try to help as many and as much as we possibly can. My friend, he recently had a very fortunate thing to happen to him. He wrote some books, and the books did really well. He has more money now than he'll ever know how to spend. Millions of dollars. He went to some people in his church, though, and he was wanting to ask them how he could manage that money the best, what it was that he was supposed to do with what it was that had come to him, the millions of dollars. And the reason he went to this particular husband and wife is because he knew they had done well for themselves. He knew that they had been fairly lucrative. They had jobs that were fairly lucrative, but they lived very modestly. And he said, help me understand this. This is it's just happened to me. What am I supposed to do with this? And what he came to find out about them was that they told him, we only live on $85,000 a year, and we've done that for several years. And that's a lot of money. $85,000 is a lot of money, no doubt about it. And then my friend, through the course of the discussion, came to find out that this couple makes a combined $350,000 a year. And he said, years ago, we decided that we were just going to make this amount of money and live on it, and everything else we're just going to give away. And he said, so because of that, we've blessed our church in many ways. We've blessed capital campaigns, and we've given to causes, and we've helped people, because we just decided a long time ago that we were only going to live on this amount of money. And my friend said to him, well, how is that possible? How did you get to a point where you would just give away $200,000+? And the guy said, well, we just decided that we're only going to live on this amount, and we made just a little bit more than that at the time. And so then as raises came in and promotions and new job opportunities came our way, we just continued to give it away, It's a bit extreme, I know, but Inevitably, these words of Jim Elliot are so true. He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose. After the text messages were sent to Hawaii that it was a false alarm, the media naturally swooped in, and they wanted to know what people's responses were to what had just taken place. One of the interviews really struck me. There was a man that was asked how he felt about what had just taken place. And he said, well, at first I was incredibly angry. I was frustrated. I was mad that they would put my family through this. But then I came to realize that what just happened was really a gift. And then the news reporter said, a gift? What do you mean? They just said they were going to send a missile at you. He said, no, it's a gift because now I realize I'm not going to live forever. And I realize what's important. And it's helped me to realize like how I really need to live my life. This poem, I think, summarizes what we're talking about really well. I counted dollars while God counted crosses. I counted gains while he counted losses. I counted my worth, my things gained in store, and he sized me up by the scars that I bore. I counted honors and sought degrees. He counted the hours I spent on my knees. I never knew till one day by the grave how vain are the things we spend our lives trying to save. Let's have a word of prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, help us, Lord, to see what is important. Help us, Lord, to realize how you want us to manage what you've given us. God, may we be a people who align all that you've given us with your priorities. That one day, Lord, when we meet you in the end, you would look at us and say, well done, good and faithful servant. We thank you for your grace, and we give you this in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.